Hi, thanks for joining us again. I'm Brad Littlejohn. I'm talking here with Dr. Alastair Roberts about how Christians should respond to the coronavirus crisis and to the new questions that it raises. And in particular, I think the problem behind all of the other problems that we've discussed in some other um, episodes of this, the question of how should we respond when we feel the authority is being unjust, but how should churches respond to commands to remain closed, etc. The problem behind these problems is a problem of knowledge, and we have an epistemic crisis behind anything else. And I think the virus has really exposed the level of epistemic crisis that we are in many ways in the Western world, where we do not know what authorities to trust. We do not know what counts as knowledge. We do not know how to distinguish facts and opinions. Many of us, I think, have been very it's interesting, it seems in many ways sometimes Christians more than anyone else have been schooled in the postmodernist idea that sort of all facts are biased. Everything is just a perspective. And so we've become, an analogy I've used a number of times is I feel like many Christians have become like the dwarves in the last battle who refused to be taken in. And we've made a sort of badge of pride of our skepticism. And we have our kind of our BS detector up all the time, and know not to trust the experts. And sometimes that's a very appropriate stance, and yet, as a general sort of modus operandi for operating in a complex world, it's not necessarily as it did for the dwarves in the last battle. It's not the right stance. Sometimes you are indeed being presented with truth, and you need to wake up and see it, as in the last battle. So, with this discussion, I really want to explore why we have found it so difficult as a society to understand what is happening, and to form correct judgments, and to know when to trust experts, and to know how to sort through various data, and to know, how deadly is it? How deadly isn't it? What is the risk? What isn't the risk? These kinds of questions that, in theory, we should be able to answer better than ever. We have access to more information than ever before. We have, we can, if you used to, it would have been, you would have just had to take someone's word for it, but now you got several great websites where you can go and see the charts for yourself, see all the different stats. Many of the studies are publicly available. We have a wealth of information, and yet amidst this flood of information, we find ourselves drowning and unable to figure out which way to swim.
When we're thinking about an issue like this, the issues of trust, information, and authority are imperative. If we're going to act in terms of wisdom, it can't just be what's between our two ears, because we have very little between our two ears in terms of the sort of knowledge that is required to operate well within a society. What we need are networks of authority that tell us what to do, that establish order within society, that enable us to act in a way that, even without knowing, is a good one for us. We also need networks of information where we can have reliable information given to us, and we can be exposed to different points of view that we can weigh up well. And so we need we need good counselors surrounding us. And then we also need networks of trust. Where there is a breakdown of trust, it's very difficult to have those other things. So if you do not trust your authorities, you'll tend to resist them. If you do not trust the people who are giving you expert information, if you distrust the experts, it's very difficult to have wise counsel. And so we need trust, information, and authority if we're going to act in terms of wisdom. And one of the struggles that we have within this situation is, for instance, if people do not have the ability to take counsel well, they will tend to choose the flatterer, the person who underwrites whatever position they have, and they are the expert of choice. And a cafeteria approach to authority or to experts and information, we've seen where that leads. Right. And on the internet, one of the dangers is, on the one hand, you can have an environment where there is more interaction between viewpoints and more sharpening of viewpoints than ever before, or you can have just sheep without a shepherd choosing their own shepherd of choice. And one leads to disaster, the other leads to actually a sharpening of opinions and a greater knowledge. And I think, sadly, we've tended to choose the one that leads us to a greater degree of self-expression, that we are not bound by expert opinion or something. But
Right.
taking expert advice is not the same thing as being ruled by experts.
Right.
We need to be people who are like the king. The king is someone who is not the universal expert, but the king is someone who's surrounded by wise counselors, takes on board and weighs up their counsel, and is able to choose an actionable and a responsible and a reasonable course of action on the basis of those different forms of advice and counsel that he's receiving. And he knows how to ask good questions. He doesn't have to be the expert, but he has to have a basic degree of literacy in the process of taking counsel and weighing counsel. So for instance, how certain is this information? What is the probability here? Or what is the reliability of this information? How was this data arrived at? Those sorts of questions are just very basic questions when you're trying to weigh things up. And also, what are the alternative positions to this? How has this position been criticized? And there, the danger is, on the one hand, people saying we don't trust the experts. On the other hand, people saying we should believe the experts, and just going with one particular set of experts and not hearing opposing positions to those and challenging positions that would sharpen their understanding. Now, what you see in a healthy scientific context, for instance, is there's development of opinion. People change their mind as new information comes along. They have their positions sharpened through critique, through challenging data, and all these sorts of things. And that requires, in addition to what we've already discussed, an ability to deal with a form of knowledge that is probabilistic, that is statistical, and is not necessarily certain. So what we're dealing with are not straightforward predictions. We're dealing with projections under certain circumstances in terms of certain, we may be dealing in terms of expectations under certain policies that have been adopted, or risks that we might assume. And in those sorts of situations, uncertainty is factored into our decisions. Right. And so it's very easy to look with hindsight and second guess everything that we've done, because hindsight has a lot more information to hand. It knows how things have panned out. It knows a lot more about the actual threat that we're dealing with, because it's seen how that threat has played out. But to act responsibly, you need to take into account the unknowns, not just the things that we know. Right. And there, I think, we're seeing something of the fact that most people are not very equipped to work with numbers and the abstraction of numbers and relate them to the concrete stuff of real life. On the other hand, many mathematicians can have the abstraction of the numbers and they're perfectly able to work in terms of those, but not necessarily that well able to connect them to the actual choices about the data that was made and some of the ways in which the complexity of society doesn't actually fit in with the tidiness of the system. And so translating between the numbers and the real life situations and scenarios is something that the person who's taking wise counsel needs to be able to do. So there's a certain set of skills and abilities that are required for the person who's taking counsel, who's not the expert, but the person who's taking counsel from the experts and learning from the different positions out there, weighing up opinions and starting to think about what would be a healthy course of action. Now, the interesting thing I've found is, following this particular issue, how often it was people who were not main experts in epidemiology or virology or even on the economic issues who were ahead of the game on this. It was people who are used to making statistical judgments, people who are good at integrating knowledge from a great many different sources, had a wide network of trust and information, and were able to take all of those things on board and arrive at some sort of judgment about risk levels and what would be a prudent course of action given this degree of risk. And it's been interesting to see also that group tends to be non-ideological. And yet when the crisis hits the ideological camps, they tend to think in black and white categories, in antagonistic frameworks, And those categories are just not healthy at all for thinking about a crisis like this. Likewise, the breakdown of trust that we have within many of our societies exacerbates our struggle to respond, because if you cannot trust the experts, if you think the experts all have some sort of hidden agenda, if you've been raised in a situation where your society or your particular context is not integrated into a wider chain of knowledge, of information and authority and trust, then it's very difficult to act in terms of wisdom, because you feel disconnected from authorities. You feel that they're over against you and that their actions limit you. And you think of the experts, that they're a different class. They're people who have their own class interests. They're not in it in a way that would actually serve the common good, and certainly not any common good that you would have a real investment in. And so I think all of these issues lie behind an epistemic crisis that is surfacing at this point. And suddenly we're realizing that these things really matter. A government cannot rule if it cannot be trusted. Right. And people cannot act in terms of wisdom if they cannot exercise trust. And they cannot act wisely if they don't have the ability to move beyond just choosing the counselor of choice. Right. If they're not able to weigh up a host of different counselors with different positions, then it's very difficult for them to act wisely.
I mean, I think the dilemma here is that many of the virtues, the epistemic virtues you're talking about, of being able to weigh up wise counsel, being able to think in terms of probability and sort of conditional predictions versus conditional projections versus predictions. These are epistemic virtues that I don't think, realistically we can't expect the vast majority of people to have. These are kingly virtues, this kind of wisdom, and yet we live in a society now where, in many ways, for good, we don't have a simple bifurcation between the shepherd and the sheep. We don't have the ruler who is indeed able to think through these complicated questions, and then the rest of us who just sort of sheep-like follow along. The rest of us expect to be involved in the process. The rest of us expect to be consulted. The rest of us expect to be heard. That's what it means. That's what democratic governance means. And yet we're butting up against the fact that most of us are not equipped with the tools to wrestle through some of these complex questions. I mean, I was, as you were speaking, I was reminded of distinction Daniel Kahneman has drawn between the possibility and plausibility. And he says probability and plausibility. He said the problem is that most people confuse the two. They're actually thinking in terms of mathematical probability, the abstractions of that, and the ranges of uncertainty and that sort of thing. Most people are not actually equipped to do that, and it takes a lot of training to be able to do that. So what people do instead is, when they're presented with a kind of vague set of numbers, they translate it into something concrete, a mental image, an imagination. And so I think, actually, I think this is part of what's going on. I've been puzzled by a number of people sort of saying, well, this doesn't seem nearly as bad. It's obvious, people say this obviously isn't as bad as they said it was going to be. And part of that is related to the fact that, as you said, taking preventative action is what keeps it from being that bad. But part of it, I think, also is the fact, I've been looking at them like, well, the numbers look pretty bad, but I think many people don't actually think in terms of, they form kind of a mental image of I'm expecting to see people dying in the streets almost, and I'm not seeing that where I am, and so it doesn't feel bad, right? Daniel Kahneman, I really recommend this book to anyone listening, the Thinking Fast and Slow. He gives all kinds of examples of what he calls a substitution, where we substitute a plausibility judgment, which is to say, how much can we sort of form a kind of concrete mental image of what that thing, from a probability judgment. And I think we're really hampered by that right now, where there's a huge disconnect between the kind of mathematical abstractions necessary to think about what does an exponentially growing epidemic look like, and then how is that determined in so many ways by the decisions that we take, versus how do I imagine what a really bad epidemic would look like, and this doesn't feel like that.
Yes.
and we're in a dilemma of, through no fault of their own, most people are not able to, I think, to grapple with this on the kind of level that decision making requires. And that's precisely where I think that trust is necessary to be able to understand, to say, look, I don't get everything that's going on here. I don't get everything that's going into these projections, but I'm willing to trust that those who are making the decisions do get it. And for any number of reasons, that trust is no longer present in many Western societies. And the media, it's breaking down trust between us and our rulers, our we don't use that language very much anymore. Our leaders, our leaders, and also with our media, which are responsible for informing us. And I think that's something I've seen in the lead up was all the time. People saying, well, this obviously isn't a big deal. It's just a bunch of media hype, And I'd say, what are you pointing to? I actually I've seen media actually underplaying it, but people are conditioned to expect media hype. Everything is hype now. Everything is a breaking news, all caps situation. And we're stuck in the boy who cried wolf dilemma here in the Western world, in America at least particularly. I hope it's not as bad over there, but where people have become so used to every news story being presented as, sort of threat level 10, or that this is something really, really important is happening now, that they don't, there's no way to get through to them that something actually unusual is happening. Something, not the end of the world, indeed, but something it is the end of the world as they know it. This is life is going to be different after this. And we don't have, how can that be communicated to us when we've learned to tune out the media because they've forfeited trust?
And they really have forfeited trust. I think one of the things that we're noticing is that if you just trusted the media on this, because the experts, for instance, the CDC was saying don't wear masks. We're being told by Vox and places like that this is not going to be anything to worry about, folks. And so when we come to it, we realize these sources that are the experts, supposedly, they didn't prepare us. And there, I think we need to recognize that it's not just the experts in the sense of one particular camp of people who have a unified position on everything. That's not actually how expertise works.
Right.
It's through sharpening positions in dialogue. And there, I think, any of us who have studied deeply in one particular discipline, we recognize in our discipline that when people outside of it say, oh, experts disagree, you just face palm, because there are reasons why people disagree, and you can arrive at an intelligent and reasonable position even when experts disagree with you, because you're weighing up their positions. It's not that you just discount their positions, you're factoring in their positions into your judgments, and in some of them you're recognizing, okay, this arises out of a certain set of conditions and a certain set of commitments that I am not committed to. And I recognize that if I were committed to X, Y, and Z, then this thing might arise. But no, for instance, in the area of theology, I hold a particular doctrine of Scripture that this person does not hold. And as a result, I will read this text differently from them. And both of us have given our starting points plausible readings, but I believe my starting point is the better one. And I believe that for reasonable causes. Now, beyond that, I think if we're going to act in terms of wisdom, we need networks of trust that connect us to people who are fitting experts. And there, I think it matters a great deal how much pastors are connected with authorities, connected with expert advice, with medical authorities, things like that. And where that sort of connection does not exist, where the pastor is seen as the universal expert or the one-stop shop for wisdom, there's a real problem, because you're limited by the scope of your pastor's understanding. Now, ideally, in the past, the pastor would be trained in a situation where they would have social networks in the very context of training, where they'd be interacting with scientists, where they'd be interacting with philosophers, where they'd be interacting with people across a whole range of disciplines. And theology was not just this thing that you'd learn in the seminary all by yourself and around theologians alone. It would be something connected to the wider realm of human expertise and study and rule. And as a result, you would be someone who knew how people, to some extent, arrived at their judgments. And the pastor who'd undergone theological training would be trained to act in a sort of kingly way, as someone who was able to judge with wisdom what counselors to take seriously, what counselors were cranks, and how to weigh up different positions in terms of underlying judgments. Now, the other thing I've noticed in...
I was just going to say, I mean, because that's the thing that is a widely applicable intellectual skill, that you cannot gain expertise in everything, but you can and should and must, I would say, gain expertise in being able to detect expertise and being able to detect BS. You know, and I think that that's, you know, when often people ask me, should I get a PhD? I say, well, here's all the reasons not to get a PhD, and one good reason to get a PhD. And I don't think you need to get a PhD to do this, but one thing that you do often learn in the course of doing a PhD is researching a particular subject in depth. You become you come across scholars who know what they're talking about, and you come across scholars who obviously have an axe to grind and don't know what to talk about. And once you learn to detect that in one field, you can learn to detect that in other fields. So I don't know anything about, or I know very little about biology, but I can tell the difference between a biologist who knows what they're talking about and a biologist who's agenda driven. And I think that is perhaps what's really, urgently needed in the church today. Is there are people out there who are really, loads of people who have agendas that they're purveying, and that they're presenting a narrative that is very agenda driven, and on both sides, on all sides. And what I find is Christians who are unable to tell the difference between someone who is not always, not infallible, not always correct, but at least honestly seeking after knowledge, and someone who is just a huckster trying to sell an intellectual product. And as you say, what that means is they simply latch onto whichever one sort of scratches their itches, the flatterer, the person who's comports with their, what they want to believe is true.
And there, I think ideology is a big factor, that people think in terms of ideological frameworks, which makes it very hard to think about an issue like this, which is deeply empirical. It's something that's probabilistic and statistical, and the skills to think about that are radically different from those that you use when thinking about ideological issues, where it can be very much this sense of underlying commitments, antagonisms between different ideologies, and the distrust that exists between those different approaches. And in my experience, the people who were best prepared for the crisis and who were predicting it months in advance were the people who were of what some have called the grey tribe. They're not connected with the right or the left straightforwardly. It's a mishmash of people from all different sorts of commitments, and people who would not easily find a place within many academic contexts because they don't fit with political correctness, or they're people who will who are what some have called high decouplers.
Right.
They're able to detach emotive content from the logical content of a statement and say, is this logically true? Does it actually hold water? Let's forget about all the emotions that are attached to this. Let's think about this just as a rational question. And those sorts of people are very good at thinking about these sorts of statistical problems. Now, in my experience, it is not necessarily domain experts. It's not necessarily the person who's an epidemiologist or a virologist who's the best prepared for this sort of thing. It's the person who's able to factor in all the different considerations, and someone who's able to come to a judgment on the basis of that. And that requires more statistical reasoning. It requires the sort of person who's able to prudentially weigh many different considerations and factor them into a single judgment. Whereas most people, they're working in terms of either expertise or in terms of some ideology. And the ideology solves your problems for you because it tells you who to trust, who to distrust. But in this sort of situation, trust and distrust aren't going to get you very far, because coronavirus is something that comes in like a tidal wave and it breaks through all the existing ideological trenches. I mean,
right. It doesn't care if you're Republican or Democrat.
so I think what we need to do is establish networks of trust and information that connect everyone into this system of wisdom, where we're acting in terms of wisdom. And there, I think, as I said, pastors are very important because they mediate between.
Can I just stop you there, because I really think that's the next topic. I want to make that the next our final video here. So, so our final video here will be exploring how do we, what are some ways we can find our way out of this epistemic crisis, and what are some practical things? What should churches be doing in the midst of this pandemic?